There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod. And for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some more. So Stephen and I have the younger sister of Kira Cassidy. She is she has a bachelor's in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and she is currently a PhD candidate in wildlife biology at the University of Montana, coming to us from Missoula, Montana. Brenna Cassidy. Brenna, thanks for joining Stephen and I. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
No, this was great. I mean, like we said before, I was trying to grab Kira again because of everything that's been going on. And she suggested, why don't you talk to my younger sister? And you just happened to be doing your PhD, your candidacy on the effects. The paper that you have is the effects of state harvest on survival of wolves in Yellowstone National Park, which obviously is something that is right at the forefront. We just finished the first hunting season, or not the first, but the most recent hunting season there in Montana and the surrounding states there. So we will get into that, and that's the basis of what we're going to be discussing. But just give everybody a background, because you let us know that you're one of three sisters, but you and Kira made the journey out here into the West, into Montana and all these other states. So how did your love for the outdoors begin? Where did that bug come from?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in the outdoors and interested in nature and everything, but as a kid, actually, in Illinois, I was most interested in geology. So kind of completely different than the wildlife that I'm working with today. But I've thought about it before, and I have to think that, like, as a little kid, hiking around Northern Illinois, I was like picking up rocks, and it was something that like wasn't going to run away like a fox would, or wasn't going to fly away like a bird could. Like, I could hold it, I could carry it around, I could like investigate it with my hands. And it was something that like wasn't going to move. And I could actually like figure out what it was or bring it home and look at field guides and stuff. And that's kind of what I did until, I graduated high school. And I remember being, maybe like 9 or 10. And there's this thing called the Mohs hardness scale in geology, where you take different things and rub them against rocks and see what scratches the rock to help you identify it. And I remember having this rock and being like, okay, well, it's not being scratched by anything. And like one end of the Mohs hardness scale is diamond. And I was like, I wonder if my mom would let me take her engagement ring that has a diamond on it and scratch this rock. And I was like, there's no way, I shouldn't even ask that. That's ridiculous. But yeah, it was just, that was kind of my gateway into wildlife. And, I eventually got down the wildlife road and haven't shifted from it up until now. So it kind of went into those things that were a little bit more ephemeral, the things that could run away and hide rather than the rock I could pick up and take home.
When you get out, because you grew up in Illinois, you go to college in Wisconsin, what was the first thing that ran away from you? Let's put it that way, that led you down the path of eventual predator study? Because you're talking about wolves and reading the intro to your paper, you did studies with birds and all sorts of other creatures. So what led you down the wildlife path as opposed to the geological path?
Yeah, I don't know if I could say one particular thing. Wildlife was really kind of ever present in our life growing up. My dad was a hunter and would take us. But, most hunting in Northern Illinois is just like sitting and observing and being patient. And that has come in handy with being in a national park and just having to sit and be patient and wait for the animal that you're trying to observe and figure out its behavior to get up and do whatever it's going to. Because, wolves especially, they sleep a lot of the day. So that patience really, really paid off. Yeah, Wisconsin, going to school in Wisconsin was really wonderful. The University of Wisconsin Stevens Point is a really good school, and it's right on the edge of the Northwoods of the upper Midwest. And it's just kind of at that break of being really, really wild in kind of a classic sense of wolves and bears and tons of white-tailed deer and all these sorts of different things, as compared to the southern half of the state, which is a lot more agricultural, but still has tons and tons of wildlife in it. So it was kind of just at that point where there was a little bit of everything, and you could see how animals were moving around that area. Yeah, my interest in wildlife, I think, was mostly an accumulation of different experiences. I'm a big runner, and just running around in the early morning in central Wisconsin I saw all sorts of stuff that really kind of, piqued my interest. And I didn't get into wildlife thinking I was going to work with wolves, but here I am.
It always seems like that's the bit, is that people are like, I didn't want to work with wolves or bears, but it's this one thing happened, And I mean, in that vein, because so you're there, you're already on the crest of the wild, as you said, in the Northwoods. What's the draw out west? Did you have any influence from Kira, or was it all on your own and you said, if I really want to do this, I got to be where the wild things are, to quote the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, the great thing about big sisters is they sometimes forge a path for you. So I graduated high school in 2008, and that was right around the time that Kira started working for the Wolf Project full time. And our middle sister and I, we went out to visit, and we had taken a family road trip a couple years ago to Yellowstone, just because it was an amazing national park, amazing destination. None of us had any idea how much we would come to know and love that place. But yeah, she started working full time there, and it happened that there was a master's student and longtime Wolf Project employee who needed field technicians for that summer of 2009. So after my first year of college, I got this connection through Kira. And I've never actually asked about the conversation between those two, but I think it was partially like, hey, this is my sister. She's coming off a soccer season. She can hike. And she's really interested in wildlife, and she'll be a good addition to the crew. And it was really interesting going, because I was so new to the wildlife field. It was my first field job, and I was really, really interested in the field, but I kind of thought like, oh, this is going to be a really amazing couple months, and then I'll probably never work in Yellowstone again. We just have no idea what's going to happen in the next years to come, over a decade now. So we hiked around that whole summer searching GPS points from radio-collared wolves to see what they were doing, and mostly try to figure out what they were eating in the summer, which was really, really wonderful. And it got me into so many places that now I know really well, but I had no idea where we were going at that point. And I've been told from people I know now, like, Brenna, you were so quiet that first summer. And I was like, I had so much to learn. like I asked questions, and then just someone would talk for 20 minutes and answering that question. I was like, that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted people to just answer some of these simple questions that I had.
Yeah, you want to be that sponge, obviously, and collect all of it, because we have that too where we are, because we're starting to employ individuals who they've gone to an exotic animal college, so they understand the parameters of working with exotic and wild animals, but not necessarily specifically wolves. And so you're right, it's a lot of that learning curve of, I'm just going to be in the background for a minute and learn it all and take it all in. What's a specific experience you remember, or a specific hike, or something that you did that first year, first couple of years that sort of stuck with you that you remember?
Yeah, one thing that, it doesn't involve any sort of huge, like, actually, I guess I have two. The first doesn't involve any huge, like, oh, we saw this crazy thing that nobody's ever seen before. It was just a really long day. It was like I think 22 or 23-mile hike. Almost all of it was off trail through a bunch of forests that had been burned in the 1988 fires in Yellowstone. So it was really tough to move through. And it was one of those like confidence building hikes that I was like, oh, I got chosen to go on this really hard hike. Like, oh my gosh, I feel honored. This was really hard. Like, I'm so great. Someone thought I could do it. Um, the other one is one of my first days. I don't think it was my first day, but it was one of my first days in that week. We weren't hiking, but we were going to try and see how many pups. It was the Quadrant Peak Pack had at the time. And I had used a spotting scope a couple times. I was much more used to binoculars, but we hiked to the top of this hill to get a better view into their den area. And we were still probably almost a mile away at least from the den, and being really careful to be quiet even from that far away. And yeah, it was the first time that I had ever seen wolf pups before, and really the first time that I had seen wolves without a huge group of people like next to the road, or that's something that's classically Yellowstone. And it was just one of those things. I was sitting there with like these researchers. I was like, I am 19 years old. I was hired to hike. And like this is people's lives. Like, people do this for a living. Like, this is amazing. It did make me realize that like this isn't something that is just something I could do for a week or something. It was something that was a viable career path. So that's a core memory for sure.
Yeah, isn't it? What's that? I mean, that realization of understanding, because you, like you said, your young years, you love the outdoors, and so I think what's that? I don't want to say validation, but it kind of is that you're going into this field and you go, oh, I can actually do this for a living. I can hike, which I love to do, and all the other things that you're able to say, yeah, this is my job. I'm outside all day long doing things that I really want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. It was pretty incredible to think like, oh, this is a real job that people have. And this is something that like I'm actually majoring in college right now. And like maybe after college I can do something like this. Of course it wouldn't be in Yellowstone. Lo and behold. But yeah, it was pretty incredible to actually have that realization. And I mean, I had watched Kira, get the job where she's out watching wolves and helping people see them and collecting tons and tons of data to use in analyses that, she in the next, I think 2 years or so, ended up going to do a master's and using a lot of the information that she had collected alongside, people who had worked there for years and years. Yeah, I mean, I still like sometimes I'm like, wait, I'm actually doing this. Like, it's like, huh, interesting. But, I'm not out in the field every day now. I'm much more, computer based. But that has such a place in wildlife biology and conservation too. Like, you have to have both, I think. And I'm kind of learning about the other half of the work besides the field work at this point.
Even more specifically, what's the most satisfying part of this work for you? And maybe what's the most challenging part of this work for you?
Yeah, so I think my answer is different now than it probably would have been before I started graduate school. Because right now, I am so excited about the work that I am working on right now. I just presented, I think what we'll talk about a bit later, these effects of state harvest on wolf survival. It is like, it feels so timely and it feels important. And it feels like this kind of information is it's the thing that makes a difference, you know, like maybe when I was much more field based, I would have a different answer, something that would be a little bit more, something that would be maybe a little bit more field based or more based in talking to people in the field, like one-on-one or something, which I still think is really, really important. But right now, looking at gray wolves in the US, but more specifically in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, it's such a hot topic right now. Hunting, I mean, is such a hot topic right now. And something that I can do to contribute to that conversation feels really important. So I'm really excited about what I'm doing right now. Can you remind me of the second half of your question?
No, just what feels like the most challenging part of this particular work?
I mean, for me, it's doing things for the first time. This analysis is the first one that I've kind of done on my own, which is really exciting. And I have great mentors and people that I can talk to about it. But sitting down in front of my computer and coding something, like using computer, like coding and statistics to answer a question is like something that when I got into wildlife, I knew was a part of the job, but I don't know if I really appreciated how big of a role it was going to be in my life. So like doing that on my own and feeling really confident and then getting to go present it to people and send it to people who are decision makers and policy people, like it's really hard, but it is really satisfying to me, especially right now. And like, you know, you guys are like catching me at the point where I'm just finishing up this analysis. I just presented it at a conference and I'm like getting to talk to all these people about it. And, you know, we're coming up in the next couple months with policymakers in these states making decisions about the next year's hunting season. So it feels so timely. So it's really, really hard, but it's also really, really satisfying.
Can you just give us a rundown of your involvement with the article and the acquisition of the data and who you worked on this with?
Yeah, so the document I sent to you guys is just a summary of this analysis that we have done looking at the effects of state harvest, and by state, I mean Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, on the survival of wolves that live in Yellowstone. So we're not working with the wolves that are, you know, primarily living in those states. We're working with wolves that are collared in Yellowstone National Park. They live there the vast majority of their lives, but because park boundaries are just these straight lines for the most part, they go in and out. Even though we know from GPS collar locations that these wolves spend 96% of their time within Yellowstone and only 4% of their time outside the park. So we're working on a formal paper about this topic, about the analysis that I just sent you. So this is an effort that is myself, my advisor at the University of Montana, Dr. Mark Hebblewhite, who has been working with the Wolf Project for a long time. He did his master's and PhD work right outside Banff National Park with wolves. Has worked in Canada for a really long time as well. Dr. Doug Smith, who is the project leader and senior wildlife biologist for the Yellowstone Wolf Project. Brenna Cassidy, who is my sister, longtime employee for the Wolf Project in Yellowstone, and Dr. Dan Staler, who is the project biologist for the Yellowstone Wolf Project. So, and you know, it's really, really cool to be able to work with all of them because they were all around when I was hired for the Wolf Project, and then they've known Mark Hebblewhite for a really long time, who has ended up being my advisor through much bothering of him as I could do. And yeah, it's been a really fun project. And this is kind of only like 1/4 of my actual dissertation. So I get into a lot of other things in it, but this is one of the first things that felt really important to do right away and to get out into the world.
And where did the research come from? Who was on in the field collecting this research? Where did it originate?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are so many people that I couldn't even
Okay.
begin to
Right.
like say how many people have collected this data, because it's been every employee and every volunteer that the Yellowstone Wolf Project has had. So all of this data came from the radio collared wolves in Yellowstone, and um, everybody who has worked for the Wolf Project and gotten a location, and then that caller will say if that wolf hasn't moved, which is generally an indicator of if that wolf has died, and people who went out and got the collar and did the necropsy of that wolf to see how it died, and determined cause of death and everything. Yeah, of course, Rick McIntyre is always crucial for any Yellowstone Wolf Project anything because he was out in the field for so long as a Wolf Project employee, getting locations for all of these known collared wolves, and knows so much about them and so much of their movements. But it's really been like a huge collaborative project of every single person who's worked for the Wolf Project, because there's like hundreds of thousands of data points of just where was that wolf that day? Okay, it was here. All right, moving on. Where was it the next day? It was here. And it could be a bunch of different people for all of this.
So when we're going through this, because we're going to go based off of what you sent us, and please feel free to divulge more. We're not relegated to this, obviously.
Yeah.
And can we make this available for listeners, or is that a no?
I think we probably won't make this version available, but I'm happy to send some figures out, but this one's more of a
cool
in-depth that'll turn into a paper.
Okay. But that paper will be available once you publish the paper. It'll be available for review.
Yes.
For people to read. Yes, got it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so when we're talking about because you reference the Banff National Park, also the collared wolves,
yes.
in that first section. So what were some of the similarities? Were there similarities that you guys saw? Because it seems as though there is a correlation between the wolves the ones that were killed outside of the park. Obviously, they had a lower survival rate as opposed to the ones that stayed inside the park. And it seems as though those numbers are relatively similar. Can you give us a little bit more just about, is really that it, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really straightforward paper. This is actually something that is out in the world and published. This is published by my advisor, Dr. Hubble-White, and a Parks Canada wildlife biologist, Jesse Whitington. And they were seeing kind of the same things around Banff National Park that we're thinking about in Yellowstone right now. They're seeing that wolves that leave the park are dying at a much, much higher rate than wolves that stay in the park. And it's seasonal. It starts in the fall and it doesn't abate until the next spring. And, anyone who hears that probably thinks like, I wonder why. It's because the hunting and trapping seasons. Trapping is a much bigger thing up there right outside Banff National Park than it is around Yellowstone, but it's still, human caused mortality through hunting and trapping. But yeah, I mean, it's a very, very clear indicator of what's happening to those wolves. And they know how those wolves have died. So it's not just them going outside the park and getting killed by, another wolf or being kicked by an elk or something like that. They know that these wolves are being hunted and trapped outside there. So very, very similar to Yellowstone, but they just didn't have as many wolves collared. I think this paper uses 33 or 34 wolves, where we have a couple hundred in our data set.
Yeah, and that's one of the first topics in the in this writing here is the transboundary issues and how to manage wolves as they move between land use jurisdictions, as this calls it. Can you explain why this is such a problem? Like some would think this would be simple. Either the wolves would belong to the park or they don't, or they're in the park or they're not in the park. But it seems much more complicated than that. So just walk us through like what's the dilemma?
Yeah, it's super complicated, and it's even more complicated because there are 3 different states that border Yellowstone. And those states all have different opinions about how wolves should be managed. So makes it even more complicated. And like I've always thought like these straight line boundaries that we have on, states, countries, whatever, thinking about national parks right now, specifically in wildlife, like the straight line boundaries just don't make a lot of ecological sense. And, Yellowstone wasn't founded on wildlife. It was founded on scenery and hot springs, and wildlife were, they're kind of the second thought, unfortunately. And some of those, squiggly boundaries on Yellowstone were trades of land with, I forget if it would have been the National Forest Service, whatever was the analogous at the time, just to make them along ridge lines, to make it a little bit easier to patrol, and to make it, which did kind of make it a little more ecologically sound. But wolves can move so far if they want to, like they can disperse hundreds of miles, and to expect a wolf to stay in these straight line boundaries, it just doesn't happen. And it's even more complicated, especially with the state of Montana, because the northern part of Yellowstone is this really rich, productive area that has elk all year round. It's the only place right now in Yellowstone that has elk all through the winter, and a lot of them. But we call this area the northern range of Yellowstone. It's low elevation. There's a little less snow than the interior of the park. There's a ton of wolves there compared to other parts of Yellowstone. And that habitat of the northern range extends outside the park. So the wolves and the elk and all the other animals are moving through this really nice area in the winter that's low elevation and easier to move through. But that means that they're crossing the boundary. Even though they're not crossing it a ton, they're still doing it. And those movements are much more concentrated in the winter when it's easier to move in that area. So that also aligns with hunting and trapping seasons.
On that hunting and trapping, and I don't know if you go more in depth to this in the larger scope, but I was looking at that. I think it's on page 3 or whatever, where you illustrate the amount of hunting seasons that each of these states have had. And what's interesting to me is Wyoming, out of the 3 states, has had the least amount of hunting and trapping for wolves. I think they've had six years without any of it. Does the legislative and political aspect confuse this even more? And I'm sure I know the answer, but the fact that when they're federally delisted and then they get relisted and delisted and relisted, is that part of the issue in terms of people not understanding how to handle it? And, how does it impact the work that you guys are doing, knowing that this was a year that they got relisted in 44 states, but not in the Northern Rockies?
Yeah, it absolutely complicates it. Not only from a research standpoint, trying to tease out what these effects are, but just from, I'm sure people in all these states are confused, like what's happening? Like, what are we doing this year? What are we doing this year? When things change so much, it's understandable that people get frustrated. When you don't know what's going on, people of course get frustrated with it. In all of the states there, in Idaho and Montana, there have been hunting seasons every year, except 2010 when they were temporarily relisted. Yeah, you pointed out Wyoming has had 6 different years where they haven't had a hunting season, but they have since, I think, 2017, 2018. It's really complicated, and I can't totally blame people for being frustrated by all the changes, because you would hope that we could kind of settle in on something, some sort of compromise, and it just hasn't happened a ton. Although I will say that from 2013 to 2020, so not including this past year, there was a pretty good compromise with the state of Montana and establishing wolf management units on the northern side of the park. But that was done away with this last year.
Yeah, it seems as though the quotas, and that's part of your research also, is that the quotas, when there is this balance, it seems everything is pretty aligned. Because when I looked at the first sheet where you have the population in the park, roughly from 2009 till about 2019, the population's pretty stagnant. It's regulating itself, and things seem to be going okay. And there was a spike in 2020 in population, and then a massive drop, obviously, after this past year. So again, I guess that feeds into the theory of, there was all this balance to a degree, and then the quotas shot up this year. Where was there an unlimited limit? Was that the deal in the Northern Range, or close to it?
Yeah. So the wordage around it is so tough because in the state of Montana, I think there's six or seven different regions. I forget if the East is split into two or not, but the area around Yellowstone is considered Region 3, but that's a huge, huge area. It's probably a sixth of the state. So there was technically a quota. Well, I shouldn't say there was a quota. There was a certain number of wolves, 76 or 78, something like that, in that region that would trigger a kind of a thought process of, should we close the region? And that number was hit this year. Most of those wolves in Region 3 were harvested around Yellowstone, or about a fourth of them, I should say, maybe not most. But that wasn't something that was around Yellowstone specifically. That was something that was in that greater Region 3. That was a large part of the state. So, I don't want to say there weren't any quotas, because there was a number that the state said, okay, we should think about if we should close the region, if we should keep it open. But it was a lot more than the two wolves that were allowed to be taken in the year previously with those quotas of the wolf management units north of Yellowstone. Yeah, so I think in this document, I say this liberal quota, I don't want to say unlimited, because that gives a little bit of a different context to it.
Can you just do a basic thing right now and define what survival rate means?
Absolutely. So in this context that we'll talk about today, a survival rate is just going to be, we're going to think about survival in percentages. So in this analysis, and the way that I try to think about it is thinking in the biological year. So we think in this calendar year, from January 1st to December 31st, but a wolf doesn't really care about our calendar year. So for wolves, we're thinking about the biological year, which for us in Yellowstone is going to start on April 1st. And the reason we start on April 1st is because in mid-April, wolf pups are born, and the whole pack is centralized around this den. It's so different than the way that they act in the winter that they are going to be tied to this den. They're going to be concentrating on raising pups and getting enough food for them. And then eventually the pups are going to start moving around, and they'll get into winter, and the pack will move as one. They'll go into the next breeding season. And then on March 31st, we'll just say our biologic year will end. So if we're thinking about the biological year, we're going to think about survival as starting on April 1st, all the wolves that are alive have a certain percentage chance of making it to the next April 1st. So we'll say if the survival of wolves in Yellowstone is 80%, then that means that 80% of the wolves that are alive on April 1st will make it to that next year.
So you're looking at so let me, if I'm getting this right, let me know. So you're saying that you're saying that 20% of the packs that are or the wolves that are alive at that moment are going to die in some way, shape, or form, not necessarily from hunting and trapping, just from normal biological things that happen as well.
Yeah, you could say it like that. Yeah.
Okay.
For me right now, I'm thinking about it from an individual aspect, not quite population yet. So yeah, you can think about it as, if I'm a wolf on April 1st in Yellowstone, I have a 20% chance of dying. And on the flip side of by the next year, on the flip side of that, I also have an 80% chance of living until the next year. So depends on if you want to do the half empty or half full glass thought.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you're doing this, and that's Stephen, thanks for bringing it up because I didn't think about that.
Yeah, great question. Yeah.
Stephen always comes up with great stuff. So when you're looking at the hunting season in general, what was the major, or what, go through it and give us, what were the things that really stood out to you that made this research and made this paper necessary? Because it clearly, we like you said, we got you at a time where you're presenting all of this information. So what was the big thing that hit and you're like, no, this needs to be talked about now, and this is something that needs to be there?
Yeah. So thinking about it, because there are 3 different states, we kind of have to think about 3 different things. So Wyoming has had, hunting seasons straight from 2017. They had a couple before that, but they have always had some sort of quota system. So they've been pretty steady. It's generally from 1 to 8 wolves, depending on what little area of Wyoming you're thinking about in the Yellowstone area. Idaho is a bit more liberal with their wolf hunting in general. They have really become much more liberal with their wolf hunting and loosening regulations in the past year or so. And I was really thinking about Montana. I'm in Montana right now. I'm a Montana resident, and I was watching the changes in wolf hunting and seeing this compromise of having quota units outside Yellowstone. And I should mention there's one also outside, there used to be one outside Glacier as well. Seeing those quotas go away and the hunting regulations really be loosened and the number of wolves that each individual person can harvest go up. I was thinking, I don't work specifically in the state of Montana, but we do have wolves that cross into Montana, and they are getting harvested at a much higher rate this last winter of 2021-22. And that has to be doing something. Like it has to be important. We have to know what's going on to be able to be in talks with Montana specifically about how this is affecting wolves that primarily live in Yellowstone. I said it before, wolves in Yellowstone that are collared there and that live there are in the park 96% of the time. So that means that 4% of the time that they're leaving the park and they're dying at a pretty high rate from humans. This has to be important for the greater population of wolves in or for the greater packs of Yellowstone. So I just thought, this has to be important. And I really wanted to know how important it was going to be. And I honestly didn't think it was going to be as striking as it has been.
It looks like from 2007 to 2008, there was this big drop in numbers, and then it kind of goes down and sort of gets in line with the new hunting seasons. And as they're hunting, they go up a little bit, they go down a little bit, they go up a little bit, they go down a little bit, they go up a little bit, they go down a little bit. And then in 2020, there's like this spike. Is there any reason to believe that was part of what sort of prompted this like new initiative to bring wolf numbers down, that it seemed like they had some kind of record high that year, or?
Yeah, Montana did get a new governor right after that. And I think we have a couple new Fish and Wildlife Commission members who set or I shouldn't say quoted, they set hunting regulations for the state. And I think that was a much bigger reason rather than looking at the Yellowstone numbers specifically for new hunting regulations or loosening of regulation.
Yeah, because we talked about the political aspect of it, and I know you're going at it from the scientific biological perspective. And I think this is obviously more of what people need to hear about, well, why this is such an effective issue. And I know did you do any, was there anything in the work that you're doing now or maybe in the future that you're talking about in terms of management, lethal versus non-lethal? I mean, I know this is directed mostly about outside of the park and their percentage of survival rate once they get outside, but is that something that you're looking to tackle? Have you tackled it, or are you thinking of tackling it, sooner than later? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question. And it's definitely not my expertise. But I do know that there are a lot of really great people thinking about it. And I'm thinking specifically about right outside Yellowstone. I mean, right outside these hunting units that used to exist right outside the park. There are a couple of really amazing people in an area called Tom Miner Basin. It's an area, probably about 15 miles north of Gardner, Montana, which is the north entrance of Yellowstone National Park. And there is an amazing family up there, ranching family, that has been really leaders in the greater Yellowstone area about ways to non-lethally manage wolves to, make sure that they're not having these high rates of cattle depredation or anything. Not that that's happening around, but they're doing a lot of really good work with range riding and moving cattle around specifically to minimize conflict with predators, not only wolves, but grizzly bears as well. And they're doing things like moving any cattle that have died. They're making sure that they're moving them out of the area just to not attract any predator looking for a free meal. So while I probably don't know enough about it to be someone to have any sort of research on it. I know that there are really great people thinking about that. And not only thinking about it, but really implementing actions. And I know that they did some range rider training. I don't know if they're still doing that with COVID in the last few years, but having people come and learn about how they're minimizing conflict with predators, it's really, really impressive.
Yeah. No, we've had a couple of individuals who are range riders on the podcast already, and the work that they're doing and the coexistence measures they're doing are good in the positive about understanding how to deal with predators. Like you say, it's not just wolves, and I think people forget about that because wolves are so politicized, but it's bears and lions and coyotes, and I mean there's a lot of different predators, but obviously the wolf is the one that gets all the attention, all the news, all the news. It's crazy.
I should mention, I think from casual conversations with wildlife services members around Yellowstone, if they're working around Yellowstone, they have called the depredation or conflict issues really minuscule around the northern edges of the park, especially. I think the last depredation, I think it was chickens or sheep, from a wolf that originated in Yellowstone was 2011. It's been a really, really long time. So the depredation issue, at least for us around Gardner, is not a huge issue at this point. And I know that if it happens to someone, it becomes a huge issue for that individual. But on the kind of grand scheme, we're not seeing a whole lot of issues.
Right. And what you said something too, that you're doing the research and you're going through all these, and we're looking at these graphs, and you said it was very striking to you. What was the main thing that you saw? Was it just the numbers, the percentages? What was the thing that really struck you about when you're compiling all the numbers and you see it in front of you that really just took you by, I guess, surprise or took you back a little bit?
Yeah, so to give a tiny bit of background, the way that we split up this analysis, so we were thinking about what we were talking about before, survival in that biologic year. So the chances of making it from April 1st to the next April 1st. And we split it up into three categories. So the first category was if there was a wolf hunting season in any of those three states, or sorry, the first category, if there was no wolf hunting seasons in any of those three states. The second category was if there was wolf hunting, but there were quotas, at least in Montana and Wyoming. And the third category was if there was a wolf hunting season, but there was no quotas in Montana, because Wyoming has always had quotas. And what really struck me was if there was no hunting season at all, a wolf had an 80% chance of making it to the next year. If there were hunting seasons with quotas around, a wolf had a 78% chance of making it to the next year. And statistically, that's not really distinguishable. It's not a significant difference.
It's almost insignificant, right?
Yeah. It's, year round, it's, not significant. But what really struck me is if there was a wolf hunting season, but no quota in Montana, a wolf only had a 62% chance of making it to the next year. And that kind of blew me away. Like I had to rerun it a couple times to make sure that was correct and that I wasn't missing something, because that's a huge, huge difference. An 18% difference. Yeah, an 18% difference is so striking. And the other thing that really struck me is that this graph shows survival throughout the year. It's not just a start and a stop. And survival just tanks when you hit September and October, which coincidentally is when wolf hunting starts.
So in seasons where there's a quota, you mean like what you'd call like a bag limit for other species, like how many wolves a specific hunter can hunt? Or how many tags are passed out?
I'm sorry, I should have explained this before. In one particular area, how many wolves can be taken by anyone? So
by anyone,
yes,
okay.
Yeah, so you're required in these states to report generally within 24 hours.
Right.
If you go out and harvest a wolf, you have to call and report it. So it can be anyone, yeah. Yeah, bag limits are confusing because that did change in Montana this year as well, along with quotas and all sorts of things. So, yeah, there's a lot of different terminology.
Is the impact of having quotas simply that there are less hunters in the woods, or is there something else impacting this huge gap between 78% and 62% survival rate? Yes.
So the difference there is that if in these units where there are quotas, if the quota is 2 wolves per unit, then once there are 2 wolves reported, this person calls and say they harvested a wolf, this person calls and say they harvested a wolf, then that whole unit closes and nobody else can harvest a wolf legally. So those units with quotas are really important because they have a certain number of wolves that can be harvested, or any other animal. There are quotas for all sorts of different animals. So if a wolf, if that quota is 2 and 2 wolves are harvested, then that whole unit closes. And then, and then, wolves can move freely throughout that area without the risk of being harvested.
So I'm assuming the obvious reason that a wolf that leaves the park has 5.5 times the chances of dying, right? That the obvious reason for that is human hunting. But did Did it turn out that there were any other factors at play affecting survival rate of wolves that left the park versus ones that stay in the park?
Yeah, so the big things that affect a wolf's survival, are its age, which makes sense. You know, the older and older a wolf gets, they
right.
die at some point from whichever cause. Yeah. And coat color was actually important in wolf survival, and we can talk about that. That's a really interesting story. But the two other things were the type of harvest, whether there was none, there were these quota areas, or whether there were these, almost unlimited quotas, and the season. So it being, spring or fall or winter, which makes sense because hunting seasons are seasons, generally fall and winter for wolves. And yeah, the harvest type, whether there's harvest or not, and being in or outside the park. If there's no harvest, there wasn't really any difference in survival if a wolf was in or outside the park. Yeah. So it's not so much being in or outside the park. It's what kind of hunting is going on. If it's, if there's no hunting, of course, wolves are surviving at a higher rate. But if there is a hunting season where lots and lots of people can harvest a wolf, then there are a lot more wolves dying.
Yeah, it seems as though, and we've had this conversation too, where, and Steven's brought this point up to some of our other guests, is that it's such an extreme swing from one year to the next. Whereas, as you've outlined in the research that you've done, is that Idaho and Wyoming, for the most part, it seems has stayed fairly similar in their quotas, or their hunting limits. It seems pretty that, and just Montana had this huge swing, and like that, it really just, it almost brings more attention to the state in and of itself. And we've said this a couple of times. I mean, did you find that? I mean, did you do any research of the social aspect of how people are feeling about this, or was it strictly based on just the wolf numbers and what happened?
Yeah, so I haven't gotten into any of the social science of it. I know there are a lot of experts that are doing that, and I'm just not one of them. Yeah, Wyoming, you said it, Wyoming has been awfully steady ever since they've had a hunting season. Montana has changed a lot, and there's been a huge spotlight on Montana. I should mention that Idaho has loosened a lot of their regulations as well. But for us in particular, Idaho is such a small portion of the border with Yellowstone. Mm-hmm. It's like, I think, less than a sixth or an eighth or something, that we don't see as big of an effect with harvest in Idaho, just because of the way that Yellowstone is situated. But they have had looser regulations than Montana in the past. But Montana, I think, has gotten so much attention right now because their regulations loosened quite a lot. And this interface of the Yellowstone Montana border has gotten highlighted. I mean, I highlight it because wolves are moving across that, or around that border, much more so than somewhere like Idaho.
And on this wolf survival map that you have here, you go all the way up to parts of Alaska, Canada. Same thing in those places. I mean, even it says 80% in the northwest of the lower 48, and then when you go up to Canada, there's like a 56%, a 59% survival rate. This is all just kind of due to human hunting mostly, or were there other findings there?
Yeah, a lot of those lower percentages, 56, 59, 64, a lot of those are from areas with a lot of wolf hunting, or even wolf control for from whatever government, whether it's Canadian or from the US. A lot of those lower numbers are from human-caused mortalities of wolves.
Jeez, I'd be so curious to know if there's certain parts of those populations of wolves being disproportionately sort of targeted from hunters, because you have to think that parts of Canada and at least that far north and parts of Alaska are just, the terrain must be so difficult for folks to find wolves in and to successfully hunt wolves in.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's there has to be certain packs in certain areas that are just wildly disproportionately targeted.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing it, in and around us, that northern part is definitely much more likely of Yellowstone. It's much more likely to be harvested than a wolf in the interior of the park that's protected by the National Park Service, and they're not really going over those borders. But I do have to think that for some areas in Canada or Alaska or something like that, there are packs that are losing members every year, and some that are just like so remote that they don't really have a chance to be.
How did you define similar? It says you wolf survival in similar areas. How did you guys make the decision of how to define what similar was to Yellowstone?
So the one that I think is most similar to Yellowstone is Banff National Park. And that's what I compare this stuff a lot to, not only because I can ask my advisor about all the details about it, but because those were wolves that were collared in Banff, and they are living most of their time in Banff, but then they go outside the park. So they have this area of really, really high protection where they cannot be harvested. But then they step over a border, and that is a human border that we decided on. And then they have the opportunity to be hunted or trapped, depending on where they are. So it felt like such a clear comparison. It's so similar that I think it's the best comparison that I could make for this analysis as well.
Yeah, you have similar numbers. I mean, to both of your points, I mean, when looking at the map, I mean, the highest rate you have in there is 86%. I mean, that's literally in the middle of nowhere in Canada. I mean, that's like, I don't even know if it should, I don't know how that's not 100%, because I think it's basically like, north of Winnipeg, isn't it?
It's like northwestern Alberta, northeastern BC area.
Man, there's nothing
there's not a ton
there.
of people.
I would think. I mean, it's fascinating to me the amount of, I mean, Stephen, to your point, and Brenna, to yours, for people to get to these places, I mean, you have to fly. There has to be some sort of helicopter, plane, something to get to an area in there. I mean, you really have to want to hunt. I just, I know there are people like that, with certain species, but I mean, I don't know, and I'm trying to be biased, not to be too.
To me, it's a sign of how accessible the wilderness is at this point, with forest roads and logging roads and all the travel that we've done through there over the decades. It's like it's so accessible to get way back up in there, but once you leave even forest roads, there's nobody out there. So I just don't understand how the heck people are hunting so many wolves unless these wolves are sticking fairly close to these roads, these logging roads, or I don't know how people, I mean, but that's how accessible it is to get out in the woods with a vehicle.
No, I think this is a super, super interesting question, and something that I have actually been thinking a lot about, because thinking specifically around Yellowstone, we have, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It's an amazing place for just wild spaces, but the problem is there's all sorts of different agencies and different land uses going on. But if we're thinking about a national park, okay, you can't hunt at all in a national park, period. Going into the national forest, okay, you can do a couple other things. You can hunt and fish and, thinking about resource extraction. But then think about wilderness with a capital W areas. And there aren't roads through there. You can't have wheels through there. You can't have a chainsaw in there. So something I'm really interested in is comparing the survival of
Has
these
to be a
wolves,
difference.
whether they're in
Yeah.
a wilderness area or not. Because you're right, these roads make everything more accessible, and trails. And, one thing to maybe throw a wrench into that is that I think a lot of um, wolf harvest is, at least for hunting, maybe not trapping, it seems opportunistic. So people in these states will buy a tag for an elk or a deer or something, and
Right.
maybe they have horses and they're just like out at a backcountry campsite and they're harvesting elk, but they also buy a wolf tag. So it's really cheap.
Right.
It's
Right.
so cheap. And the thought of these wilderness areas, I got a really awesome fellowship from the University of Montana Wilderness Institute that I really want to use to think about these questions of how important are wilderness areas for wolves. And
Right.
Yellowstone isn't a formally designated wilderness, but it has the highest level of protection that anywhere in the US could possibly ask for. But these
It's
actual
true. It's
wilderness
so true.
areas are so important for animals just because humans can't move around as much in them. Like, we can't drive in them. It's so interesting.
Yeah.
So I would love to think about that more.
Yeah. Yeah. Wait for your next paper.
Yeah.
No, talk about too though, and I mean this is all and this is fascinating stuff. So talk about you, and I'm going back because you mentioned it about the coat color, age class, harvest type season. You were talking about just give us a baseline of what you found with the findings of that, and describe it also, because I butchered it there, but describe what you were talking about.
So the coat color story in Yellowstone is really, really interesting with wolves. There is a whole lab at UCLA under Dr. Bob Wayne, and there have been a number of different PhD students working on this. A couple off the top of my head are Raina Schweizer, Bridget von Holtz, Dan Staler, who is also a co-author on this study. They all have done a bunch of really cool work looking at the differences of a wolf being black or a wolf being gray. And they found that there is a significant difference in survival of those different coat colors. And a black wolf is more likely, has a higher rate of survival. They're more likely to make it to the next year. And the thought behind that is that black coat color gene is tied to immune system function. So they're thinking that black wolves are more likely to be able to fight off and survive canine distemper virus. And, that's something that we vaccinate our domestic dogs against. It's actually super interesting because, you pointed out earlier that there has been a huge dip in just wolf numbers in Yellowstone in 2008, 2009. And that was actually due to canine distemper virus that killed a bunch of pups in 2008, I believe. And the population just never really rebounded from that. So that coat color is super, super interesting because, we look at it and we're like, oh, that's like, people's hair color, but it's so much deeper than that. It's tied to immune system function.
Did we talk about this with your sister, or did we talk about this with
That was with
Ellen?
Oh, it was probably
Yeah.
Ellen.
Oh, that was a really
Ellen
cool
Brandel,
one.
Yeah. You probably talked about it with Ellen. Yeah.
That was a
Yeah.
really interesting one. The coat color thing.
It's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, what's also really interesting about that is that when wolves and domestic dogs split off, wolves didn't have that black coat color gene. They like had like a back crossing with dogs, and that's where that black color came from. So yeah, really cool.
And that's the part I think that kind of makes sense, right? I mean, the more genetic diversity, the better the gene outcome,
really
I guess. So I mean, dogs coming back in might have been beneficial because
at least
whatever's
black wolves.
manifesting is the best of the best. I guess, the more options, the better it
works out.
It seems the better it gets. Yeah. It's the same thing in domestic dogs, right? Like the more of a mutt you get, the more of a mix you get, they seem to be they seem to be smarter and healthier, you know, and they live for longer. And
no, you're right. You're right. I've seen that with mutts and rescues and stuff like that.
That's why I always get a dog that just looks like a dog. Yeah. Just a random dog.
A generic dog.
That's right.
Yeah.
Just dog. Brenna, did you find, was it when we're talking about the general part of your research, did age factor in terms of the certain wolves that decided to go outside the park as opposed to the ones that stayed in, that 94 to 6%? Did you find there was a correlation there?
I haven't looked at that. That's an interesting question, especially because you would think that there has to be some sort of tie to age because, maybe a wolf that's 2 or 3 is more likely to, try to disperse or leave its pack and try and find a mate or something like that. And maybe they're more likely to cross that boundary. I would love to look at that if there's an age effect on being in or outside the park. Dispersal is a really, really interesting topic that it's really hard to study because you have to have so many, collars out or some way of tracking individuals because once they leave, they might travel for 100, 200 miles. We've had wolves show up in Colorado, a wolf from Banff National Park showed up in Montana, multiple of them. So it's hard to study, but it would be really interesting to see who is leaving, not just how often wolves are leaving.
Is that, what's the nugget that you've taken from this first foray that is most intriguing for you out of this entire process so far?
Yeah, from this analysis in particular, I think one thing that I've learned is that the closer you can look at something, the better, because if we had just thought, how many wolves are surviving to the next year, we would have averaged, whether there's a hunting season, whether they have quotas, whether there aren't really any quotas, we would have just taken that all together and averaged it. And that wouldn't have given us the full picture of what's actually happening in these years, like last year, where there isn't much of a quota system in Montana in particular. And then thinking about that, just from a different angle, thinking about things seasonally too. Seasons are so important for a wolf. Right now, wolves the packs that have pups are tied to dens. They're generally not going and ranging as far maybe as, in winter or if the individual is dispersing or something like that. So I really think that thinking about something seasonally is really important because when we split out the difference in survival of wolves that stay in Yellowstone within the park boundary and then wolves that leave the park, even if it's just for a day, that was a huge difference too. The wolves that are in Yellowstone, 79% of them make it to the next year, but the wolves that step outside the park, only 53% of them make it to the next year. And that difference isn't they're the exact same until the fall. And then that's where that difference occurs. So they're both the same thing until the fall hits. So, I think that's very tied to what we've been talking about with harvest. A wolf that goes outside the park is, has a chance to be harvested in the fall or winter, but a wolf that's in the park doesn't. But maybe it also has a little bit of a tie to how much wolves are traveling. If they're tied to the den in the spring and the summer, like maybe they're not going as far. I'm not sure. I think a lot of it has to do with harvest, but maybe there's something else also going on. So I think looking at things in as much detail as you can gives such a better picture.
Yeah, no, it definitely seems that way. What do you what are you looking at in the future? Has any of the things that we talked about today that you're touching on, that you're going to be looking on? I mean, obviously this isn't finished. You still have some work to do here, but are you already looking ahead, or are you one of those where you're going to focus on this for right now and then, then focus on the next research, the next study, whatever it is?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what's funny is when I proposed my dissertation topic, this wasn't in it, um, which I'm pretty sure happens to all PhD students, is they have things along the way that they just can't not do. So a lot of my dissertation is focused on reproduction. I'm super interested in breeding strategies of animals, not just wolves. I mean, wolves are fascinating. They breed in a pack, and not everybody breeds, but they all help raise pups. Like, that is so interesting. And what I hope my dissertation for my PhD reveals is how much different wolves are contributing to the next generation. And contributing, I don't mean just having pups or siring them, being the mother or father. I mean, like, helping raise them and helping hunt and being an uncle or aunt or cousin or older sibling. And that is going to be tied to the genetics realm, and it gets a little more complicated and I haven't tackled it completely. But I'm going to be updating some things that Dan Staler did in his dissertation with reproduction, just to get it up to, 2021. And then combining everything that I can to see how much help wolves are giving to their relatives in their pack, and how much they're contributing to the next generation. So yeah, kind of tackling that long accepted fact that wolves are helping each other raise pups because it benefits them, even if they're not the one having young, but hasn't really been put in the scientific literature quite yet.
So jealous that you get to these are the concepts you get to think about all day.
It's pretty amazing. I'm a huge fan of being a student right now. Like, I don't know when I'll be able to just like come up with projects and be able to research them again in my career. I'm not sure what that looks like. I'm also like got approached to write like a general, like a children's book for the next year. So I'm like, this is amazing. Like, when else am I going to be able to do these things?
And you got to do the wilderness accessibility and how it meets with wolf hunting success. That would be, I need that one. I need to read that one.
I know. Yeah, I agree. That's in one of the irons in the fire right now.
Okay, cool.
That is hopefully a next step here.
Yeah, that's a huge thing that I don't think we definitely haven't spoken to anybody, I think, about that. I mean, that would be a massive.
Oh yeah, we got to do another episode at that point.
Yeah. Once you have your next,
even when you're starting it doesn't need to be done. It just needs to be.
No, we want to get you right in the teeth of all your research when you're doing it.
Everyone seems to be taking pictures next to a mountain or successfully hunting, but when you're just beyond the truck in the actual woods, I'm like, where is everyone?
I mean, gosh, even like the town of Missoula is the largest town I've ever lived in, and like, it's not that big, but the trailheads around here are packed. But then you get on the trail and there's not that many people. Where is everybody?
That's what I want to know, man. I need to know it. That's actually the title of the research paper.
That's got to be the research paper. Where do all the people go? That's what you need to know.
University of Montana, the Wilderness Institute at the University of Montana has been really generous with their Meyer graduate research fellowship. That like, this is the topic that I propose to do with them, and
you got to do that.
I'm really excited to do it.
That's awesome. You're living it. I love it. You and your sister, you guys are doing such awesome work, and it's
really
timely,
exciting,
which is the best part. I mean, you couldn't have hit a home run.
I'm really excited. I'm really excited to talk to you guys about it. Hopefully people are thinking about these things with like public comment periods coming up in, I know, Montana. I'm sure Idaho, I'm not sure what date. I think June 23rd is the date that Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Commission is meeting, and then they'll release a proposal for next year after this. And then, yeah, we'll see what happens next year.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell everybody, Brenna, where they can find you, because I know you're on Instagram, but what other places, when do you think this paper will be finalized, released, and where can they find other stuff maybe that you're working on or you're, out and about? What do you think?
Yeah, the best place to find me for all things wolf and science related is on Twitter. I should be at Brenna J. Cassidy there, and I try to keep a lot of this stuff coming out as I find it. I sure hope that I finish this paper sooner than later, but they always take a bit longer than expected. So it'll be some months for this to actually come out in the journal, but I'll link it on my Twitter as soon as it comes out.
And we'll have her socials in the description. Last thing for you, Brenna, is when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
Well, just wild wilderness. And it's one of those things that it's totally wrapped up for me professionally and personally, and it just kind of hits everything. I mean,
from picking up rocks in Illinois to now you're now you're PhD working with wolves. I mean, this is great. And listen, open invitation when you are starting that next work. When your paper's released, and when you start that next research project, you come back and we have a discussion again for sure.
Great.
So we definitely want to hear all about it.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you.
No, this has been awesome. Stephen, I'll be with you next time. How's to you all, and we'll talk to you later. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.